So I put out the last video about how I'm using honeypots to catch hackers, and I realized that I didn't do a great job of actually explaining what honeypots are and how the data from honeypots can be used. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time going more in depth about what they are, why they are, and how they can be used, essentially, and why I'm building a platform to kind of collect a lot of this honeypot information. So at all times in the background of the internet, there is a ton of traffic going on that is not human generated. I think most people would agree that that's like the vast majority of traffic you see on the internet. If you open up your logs, you're going to see a lot of illegitimate traffic. And folks usually just ignore that traffic. And most of the time, it's probably safe to do that. But it is interesting, at least, when you start looking into that traffic to see what essentially is going on. So, when I say illegitimate, there are two main categories that I'm talking about. There is one that is the web scanners or the crawlers that are essentially trying to archive all of the content on the internet, or at least the content that they're interested in. They're going to be looking at your blog and trying to pull down blog posts. They're going to be looking at your contact information and trying to pull that down. And there are various different applications of this. OpenAI got into a lot of trouble because people realized that OpenAI was scanning the internet and pulling down content from people's blogs, from people's personal websites, and they were using that essentially to train LLMs. Um, that's kind of like a given that OpenAI was doing that. Like, that's the quickest way to gather a ton of information. But people were not happy about that. I personally don't like it myself, so I get why people weren't happy. There are more legitimate use cases of these crawlers, though. Some crawlers are just exploratory, like people just interested in what kind of information they can pull down. Some of the crawlers are used for things like search engines. So Google obviously has to crawl all of these different sites in order to find out what information is on your blog so they can rank your blog in search results. You want that. That's a good thing. If you want Google, you want Google to be able to index your pages. That is exactly what Google has to do. So those are legitimate, more or less, use cases. A lot of the other traffic is significantly less legitimate. It is much more malicious. And these are the things that I'm more interested in and that most honeypots are focused on. These are usually automated vulnerability scanners that are looking for specific vulnerabilities in either web services or other services running on servers or devices. And they're going to try to exploit those vulnerabilities within those devices in order to do different things. From my experience, at least, the majority of these automated vulnerability scanners are looking for opportunities to download cryptocurrency miners and backdoors. Essentially, what they're doing there is cryptocurrency mining doesn't make a ton of money. If you just plop one on a server or on your laptop, you're going to be losing money after calculating like the cost of power and running the device. But if you install a miner on like thousands of devices, you can make a pretty easy quick buck. What a lot of them are also doing is installing backdoors that they can use to access your device later on, install other malware, and then they'll also plop a cryptocurrency miner just for funsies, I guess. So, what are they doing with these backdoors? The most common way to exploit these backdoors after they've been installed via like an automated vulnerability scanner is they will use them for DDoS attacks. And essentially what that is once they are ready to use their botnet or this massive group of servers and devices that they have exploited and put these backdoors on, they will make all of those different devices send requests at an unreal speed to the target web server. So if they're trying to take down a Minecraft server, that was actually a very common use case of Mirai. They would cause all of these backdoors to blast traffic at these Minecraft servers and essentially make it to where they can't be used anymore. They also were used against payment providers like PayPal. Very, very common use case, at least back in the day. I think they're a little bit less common now, but it's still a thing. So essentially what these backdoors would allow them to do is launch these attacks whenever they wanted, and they would use those typically for extortion or just to show off. So why honeypots then? What honeypots can do is you create a server that is intentionally either vulnerable or intentionally looks vulnerable. And what it can allow you to do is gather information about what is being done on the web. When new vulnerabilities pop up, you can use honeypot data to see how many of these automated scanners are looking for that new vulnerability at a given time. And you can use different heuristics and behavioral patterns and different things like that in order to kind of get a feel for how common these scanners are or how common this traffic is. So, for example, one of the most common vulnerabilities that are exploited by a lot of these automated scanners are WordPress vulnerabilities. WordPress runs the majority of the internet, even though it's like a garbage company and the software is terrible. It still runs most of the internet. It, for a long time, was the most common way to get a website up and to get a blog up was through WordPress. So it's very, very common and incredibly vulnerable, the platform itself as well as the plugins. So what you would look for is specific URL patterns or specific traffic patterns that indicated that a piece of traffic was a scanner that was looking for that vulnerability. And if you had a ton of these honeypots deployed in different places across the world, you could kind of get a feel for how common these scanners were, how basically how much people were focusing on these vulnerabilities and how frequently they were being successfully exploited. If you have a good honeypot, which is what I'm trying to build, obviously you can capture the second stage. So, okay, the vulnerability has been exploited. What are they doing with it? Are they installing a backdoor? If so, what's the backdoor like? Can I download that backdoor and start reverse engineering it? What are they using these backdoors for? What kind of cryptocurrency miners are they dropping? What are the addresses of the wallets that they're trying to send the stolen funds to? These are all incredibly interesting things to security researchers because then they can use the traffic that they are looking at actively on these honeypots to develop mitigations for the actual scanning itself. So essentially what I can do is I say, okay, I'm seeing this specific pattern on my honeypots. I'm going to deploy some sort of mitigation, some sort of way to block these threats, whether it's like an IP blacklist or, an actual like behavioral detection that can then protect my network, my customers, whatever. So this traffic itself can be incredibly valuable for people who are trying to actually mitigate these threats. It's basically a good way of seeing what's going on the internet without using like valuable infrastructure. Obviously, like you can look at your own logs, the logs on the servers that you're running different applications on, and you can see, okay, well, we're getting these scanning attempts on our logs. But if you have honeypots that are essentially serving as like this front line that is gathering this data for you, you can essentially try to catch these things before they actually hit your web servers instead of waiting until they hit your web servers and hoping that you block it in time. I question just how valuable the basic feeds are, and that's why I'm going to try to really push the boundaries and the envelope on what honeypots can actually do. A honeypot that just says this IP is scanning for this vulnerability isn't that useful. A honeypot that says this IP, which is associated with this specific group, and we've also observed it doing this, and this thing, is trying to drop this piece of malware that does this, and this thing, and we can attribute this piece of malware to this, and this group. When you really start to mine some data out of it, that's where you can get some really interesting research and really interesting patterns out of it. I'm not under really any like aspirations to say that like this is like any kind of silver bullet. No security solution, no piece of data, no data source is a silver bullet for security. That will never be the case. But you can at least get some really interesting information out of a lot of these services and out of a lot of these feeds, especially if you start really mining into it and getting the interesting data out of it. I've got a lot of really cool future plans for it, but at the moment, the focus that I'm having is basically gathering the top level raw data that I can then start mining out and, gathering more information about different patterns. That's where you can kind of start to get the initial stage interesting research out of it. So essentially, kind of the TLDW at the very end of the video, you can use honeypot data to get an understanding of what these vulnerability scanners are looking for and how they are using these vulnerabilities to do different malicious things. And that can be incredibly valuable. if you can actually mine the interesting relationships out of it. Uh, if you have any questions, drop them down in the comments. This can kind of be a weird in the weeds technical thing, especially for folks who don't have that much of a security background. But yeah, I will keep everybody updated on what I've been working on so far. I'll have a couple of updates this week. Take it easy. Peace.